Mr. Johnson noticed the foxes behaving strangely near his farm, appearing restless and frequenting his property more than usual. They seemed determined to get his attention, often interrupting his morning chores. He decided to pay closer attention, hoping to uncover the mystery behind their odd behavior. Mr. Johnson couldn't shake the feeling that the foxes were trying to show him something important. But before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Despite initially dismissing the fox's odd behavior, they became hard to ignore. Every morning they would approach Mr. Johnson during his chores, almost as if they were trying to tell him something. One particular morning, Mr. Johnson was feeding the pigs when a fox stood just a few feet away, staring right at him. Its eyes were nearly pleading, giving him a feeling of unease. This wasn't typical behavior for a wild animal, and it gnawed at Mr. Johnson's mind. He began to ponder what they wanted to convey. He found himself repeatedly glancing toward the woods, half expecting to see those eyes watching him. The more he thought about it, the more he felt there was something he was missing. His curiosity was definitely piqued. Driven by growing curiosity, Mr. Johnson made a conscious decision to pay closer attention to the foxes around his farm. Mr. Johnson's suspicions were confirmed when he noticed the foxes becoming even more restless and persistent. They appeared not just in the mornings, but throughout the day, making their presence known. Mr. Johnson started connecting dots when he remembered that some of his chickens had gone missing recently. Additionally, he noticed a few fences that appeared tampered with, but not in a way that wild animals typically would. He began to wonder if the foxes were responsible for the missing chickens and tampered fences. However, he had doubts. The damage seemed far too neat and precise for wild animals. Hoping for some clarity, Mr. Johnson decided to discuss the odd behavior with his neighbor, Mrs. Wilkins. "Have you noticed anything unusual with the foxes around here?" he asked her one afternoon. She shrugged and answered, "Wild animals act weird all the time. Nothing to worry about." Her casual dismissal did little to ease his mind. Despite her reassurance, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this. Even after talking with Mrs. Wilkins, Mr. Johnson's curiosity remained piqued. He decided it wasn't enough to simply dismiss the fox's behavior as random. "I'm going to keep a closer eye on them," he said to himself. Every time he noticed one, he'd take mental notes of their behavior. He was determined to uncover whatever message they were trying to convey. As Mr. Johnson recalled recent occurrences around the farm, the small disturbances began to seem too suspicious to ignore. Missing chickens and tampered fences now bothered him even more. Over the next few days, the fox's actions became even more intense. It wasn't just one or two appearances, they were there multiple times a day. Morning, noon, or night, their presence was constant. Mr. Johnson noticed them at every turn as though their urgency had escalated. One morning, as Mr. Johnson was loading hay onto his tractor, a fox stood directly in his path until he stopped the engine. The audacity of the animal startled him. He wasn't used to wild creatures daring to come so close. Shutting off the engine, he watched as the fox stood its ground, fixing its gaze on him. It was like a silent plea for him to follow or pay extra attention to something. Realizing it wasn't just one, but several foxes trying to get his attention was a turning point for Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson wondered about the foxes' coordinated efforts aimed towards him. Their actions seemed purposeful, almost deliberate. What could be so important that wild animals would work together in such an unusual manner? "Maybe you should just ignore them," his wife suggested one evening as they sat down for dinner. Mr. Johnson shook his head. "I don't think I can." "There's something odd going on," he replied, pushing his food around on his plate. He couldn't shake the feeling that these foxes were trying to tell him something important. Ignoring them wasn't an option. His curiosity had taken hold completely. Determined to understand the fox's peculiar behavior, Mr. Johnson decided to continue paying attention. He couldn't dismiss them as mere nuisances any longer. Mr. Johnson's resolve to uncover what the foxes wanted grew stronger with each passing day. Their relentless attempts to get his attention couldn't be ignored any longer. He prepared himself mentally for what might lie ahead. The following day, the foxes returned with even more urgency. Mr. Johnson noticed it right away. Their yips were louder and their movements more frantic. It was clear that something had escalated. Determined, Mr. Johnson grabbed his coat and decided to follow the foxes. He wasn't sure what he would find, but his curiosity and sense of urgency pushed him to act. With a resolute pace, he started following them into the nearby woods. The foxes led him through an unfamiliar, twisting path that he barely recognized. The woods grew denser, and the underbrush tangled around his boots. The eerie atmosphere and distant woodland sounds followed him as he kept pace with the foxes. Mr. Johnson found himself carefully navigating over jagged rocks and loose soil. Ignoring his growing apprehension, he pressed on. The mystery pulled him forward, a magnet for his curiosity. After what felt like hours of navigating through dense thickets and crossing a shallow stream, Mr. Johnson and the foxes reached a clearing. The air felt lighter, but the sense of anticipation grew stronger. He wondered what could be so important that the foxes would lead him to this remote spot. In the middle of the clearing, Mr. Johnson spotted a worn-down, abandoned cabin. The foxes paused at the edge of the clearing, almost reverently. It was as if they respected the space they had brought Mr. Johnson to. The animals sat quietly, their eyes fixed on the cabin, waiting for him to make the next move. Their behavior was unusually calm, a stark contrast to their earlier urgency. Hesitating for just a moment, Mr. Johnson approached the cabin cautiously. The air around him seemed thick with anticipation, making each step feel deliberate and significant. He moved carefully, each footfall echoing lightly in the quiet clearing. His eyes scanned the surroundings, alert and wary of any unexpected developments as he drew closer to the structure. The foxes sat, watching him intently as he approached the cabin. He circled the cabin, looking for signs of why the foxes had led him here. Mr. Johnson scanned the area, looking for anything that might give him a clue. All the while, the foxes remained at the edge of the clearing, their eyes never leaving him. He hesitated momentarily, debating whether or not to enter the cabin. With cautious determination, he pushed the door open, bracing himself for what he might find inside the old, decrepit structure. Dust and cobwebs covered every surface, and the floorboards creaked under his weight. The decayed state of the cabin was apparent, with broken furniture and debris littering the floor. However, it was the larger, more disturbing elements on the ground that caught his attention. The sight made his stomach churn as he stepped further inside, driven by curiosity. A large, broken trap caught his attention in the center of the room. This wasn't something one casually leaves behind. Mr. Johnson bent down to inspect it closely, wondering what purpose it had served. The sight of it only deepened the mystery. He could tell it was used recently, given the condition of the surroundings and the stories hidden in its rust. He carefully stepped over the debris, heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and dread. As he moved closer, the sound grew louder, making each step feel heavier. He knew he was getting closer to discovering the source of the noise. In a corner, Mr. Johnson found a young fox with its leg caught in a brutal metal trap. The sight was heartbreaking. In that moment of realization, everything clicked for Mr. Johnson. This was why the other foxes had been so desperate to get his attention. The fox was in agony, whimpering softly as Mr. Johnson approached. With every whimpered cry, his resolve to help solidified. He knew he had to act quickly to relieve its pain. Mr. Johnson sank to his knees and carefully pried open the trap. Slowly, he worked the jaws of the trap apart, aiming to free the tortured leg without causing further injury. He finally released the fox's mangled leg, feeling a surge of anger at the deliberate setup. His temper flared, thinking about the cruelty involved. He gently lifted the fox, feeling its trembling body against his hands. Carrying the injured fox outside, Mr. Johnson noticed the waiting group of foxes easing up slightly. Their frantic energy seemed to subside as he stepped out of the cabin. The collective relief was almost palpable. The group of foxes watched intently, their eyes following his every move. Mr. Johnson placed the injured fox gently on the ground, wondering what to do next. A sense of accomplishment flooded him, but questions about the traps and their purpose remained unanswered. Still unsettled, Mr. Johnson began thinking about contacting the authorities. What he had found wasn't just a random act, it was deliberate and cruel. Dialing the local animal control seemed like the first logical step. He needed to ensure the safety of the remaining foxes. While dialing, Mr. Johnson noticed more traps, hidden in the brush around the cabin. Mr. Johnson examined the traps more closely. As he investigated, he discovered evidence linking the traps to a local farmer. There were distinctive marks and signs that he recognized. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He knew who was behind these cruel devices. The sense of betrayal was immense. This was someone he considered a neighbor. Understanding the cruel intent behind these traps, Mr. Johnson made a mental note to confront the farmer later. His anger was palpable, and he knew he couldn't let this go unanswered. For now, ensuring the injured fox received immediate help was his priority. However, the confrontation would come soon enough. He wasn't about to let these acts of cruelty slide. He had to protect the foxes and hold the guilty party accountable. At that moment, Mr. Johnson comprehended the foxes' desperate actions to lead him to their suffering young. The pieces of the puzzle finally fit together. They had been trying to guide him to the traps, seeking his help. Realizing this, he felt a deep responsibility to assist them. Now it was his turn to act. He made a silent promise to himself and the animals that he would do everything in his power to stop the cruelty. Mr. Johnson provided the distressed foxes with needed help, feeling an intense responsibility weighing on him. He made sure the injured fox was comfortable and safe until animal control arrived. The other foxes watched closely, their eyes reflecting a mix of trust and gratitude. Returning to his farm, Mr. Johnson began planning the next steps to prevent further cruelty. He considered contacting local authorities and rallying the community to address the issue. Every action he planned was a step towards ensuring these traps were removed and enforcing stricter rules against such cruelty. He realized that exposing the responsible party wasn't enough. He needed to create a safer environment for the foxes and other wildlife. Resolved and determined, Mr. Johnson prepared to confront the farmer and protect the foxes. He knew it would be a difficult conversation, but it was necessary. The well-being of the foxes depended on it. He gathered the evidence he had found, ready to present it. Every plan he made revolved around putting an end to these cruel practices. His resolve was unshakable. He was determined to make a difference.